Welcome back to Analysis, where we've been looking at the life and legacy of Tony Benn, who died last week. John, at the end of the first half there, Andrew Slaughter was saying that, he had a terrific ability to adapt, to be able to, to confront new forms of protest and to be part of them. I'm wondering whether you think that's because he had a sense of history, because he's, the writing on the wall shows that he used to do with folk singer Roy Bailey were all about the radical traditions stretching back to the levellers in the 17th century. And I guess if you're looking at the world that way, you're kind of expecting things to change and perhaps more adaptable because of that?
I think that must be part of it. I've actually got that wonderful Faber book, which is his edited volume of all of the different anthology of songs and speeches and writings of a radical nature going back to the 13th century. So he was obviously steeped in that tradition. But at the same time, I think one of the other things that rooted him was values. And so while he may have been able to change his application of those, the values themselves remained constant. And again, I think that's incredibly appealing to people at a time when you feel most politicians don't have those set values and are much more prepared to swing with the latest fashion. And I think for Tony Benn, it was perhaps grounded on a radical tradition which he saw taking place not just in British politics but internationally. Because I think that's the thing we still have to talk about, his great internationalism, the fact that he saw the struggles in one country being part of a much bigger whole, both through history but also geographically at the same time.
What do you think about that, about his sort of sense of history? Because he would bring that to bear very, very frequently in the speeches.
Yeah, no, I think he had a very strong set of radical views, and as you say, I'm not sure it's completely true that he moved, hugely to the left over time. In fact, I think there's a sort of subtext to this claim about him, which is, and actually, I don't even, funnily enough, I don't think that becoming more radical as you get older is actually that unusual, given the kind of experience that people have of neoliberal life now and the attacks on older people and stuff. But anyway, I think there's a subtext here, which is that what the politicians, or some of them particularly, are saying is it was a bit of unusual for a politician to make it in the establishment and not become completely corrupt and cynical. That's what I think they're really saying, partly. So I think no doubt it was the strength of his opinions that carried him through, partly. I also think he had another quality that came to the fore after 2001, which is his affinity with ordinary people and his desire and ability to listen to people all the time. I mean, everyone says this, and rightly, he was genuinely interested in the conversations he had. He wasn't just trying to impress people. The conversations you had with him were always two-way. If anything, he wanted you to dominate because he wanted to learn from you. And, I think one of the things that stood out about his contribution to the movement was that he was always on the road. He'd go up and down the country doing meetings and talking to people and trying to find out where the movement was at. So he therefore had a real sensitivity to the amount of anger there was against what Tony Blair was doing, which so many politicians didn't have.
Yeah, let's just unpack that a little bit, because that is an interesting. We should be fair and say there have been some very good appreciations, and one of them indeed was Gary Young's in The Guardian. Yeah. And one of the points that Gary Young made, he said, he remembers going down to Cornwall on the train with Ben speaking at a meeting. He was staying down the night and coming back the following day from Cornwall. Gary Young, this is. Ben was coming back that night to London. Then he was going from London to speak at the Burford Levellers' Day protest. And by the time Gary Young was returning from Cornwall the following day, Ben had been to Oxford and come back for another meeting in London. Now, the popularity that he had, quite contrary to the kind of media story, and these days the kind of social media story, it was just based on slog, wasn't it? It was just based on that he spoke in hundreds of places, and he spoke all the time.
Yeah, but I think this is connected to the point that John was making earlier about his political approach, really. I mean, he really did believe that it was the movements outside of Parliament in general that historically have changed things, and he's obviously right on that. And so, therefore, he took the movement seriously, and he knew that organising people and motivating people and inspiring people was absolutely critical to this. I mean, no movement is spontaneous, and it takes a lot of work to keep a movement on the road. And amazingly, really, for someone who'd been at the heights of politics in the way that he had. He had that understanding, and not only did he have the understanding, but he drew the conclusions. And I'm telling you, it's no exaggeration to say that if we organised a major Stop the War event and didn't invite him, he'd be on the phone complaining in advance or afterwards if he only heard about it. You know, he wanted to be right at the heart of the movement because he understood its value. And, you know, that's a serious legacy for all of us.
Andrew Slaughter, do you think that you hear a lot in the coverage about about that he came from a kind of very privileged background and became a socialist, as if there's something kind of wrong with this, whereas when people talk about people becoming part of the establishment, that's kind of all right. Do you think part of it with Benn was that I think of him rather in the same frame as I think of my old friend Paul Foote, who came from a similar background, that they saw it, they'd been born into it, they didn't like it, and it held no charm for them?
I don't know. I mean, some people have said that he felt guilty about his background. I'm not sure that's true either, really. I think it wasn't that unusual. Again, going back to, say, the 45 level, quite a few of the senior people in that, the people who set up the welfare state and the NHS, were from relatively privileged backgrounds. The strength of the Labour Party is it combines several different trends. It combines, if you like, that sort of intellectual side of things, which could be from any class background, but a lot of people from quite what would then have been an educated class at a time when very few people went to university, with the trade unions and with other mass movements and other left-wing organisations. And it's that fusion that gives it its strength and its mix. I mean, fortunately, we now live in a society, thanks to Labour governments, where up to 50% of people do get a chance to have further and higher education, and so you don't necessarily have the same sort of divisions. But I don't think he either felt guilty about that or felt that he had something to prove. I think that's just that both emotionally and intellectually he was on the left, and he used his very considerable talents to the fore.
John, do you think that maybe, I guess one sort of point to make off the back of what Andrew's saying is that there was a kind of public service ethos in certainly at the creation of the welfare state, and therefore a figure like Benn would have been less unusual than he is today, where, indeed in the Labour Party, the whole language of aspiring and getting on and getting up and the whole individualistic culture is very different.
Absolutely, and I think that concept of a life in service to the broader populace was something which trumps the crass individualism which you see everywhere today. And I think that goes back to what Chris said. The idea of being part of a movement where your individual needs are subsumed within that collective whole, and you pursue what you want to try and achieve through collective action, that was absolutely at the heart of everything that Tony Benn did. And I think that's why that generosity of spirit, whereby he was always, so many people have said, he gave us so much time, he never needed to give us the time he gave us, but he just did it absolutely naturally. That comes from not putting yourself first, but just seeing yourself as part of a collective movement. And again, part of the course of history, that you're part of that stream which you hope is going to be a progressive stream, and you're going to try and push in a progressive direction.
Andrew, do you think that that kind of mood, that the public service mood that you first touched on, if you look at the reaction to something like Ken Loach's The Spirit of 45, there's very wide swathes of society which still hold to that, despite the fact that the kind of overt public discourse is very different. Do you think that was one of the sources of Benn's popularity? He'd stayed with that. Quite a large section of working people have stayed with that. They liked each other.
He said, I think quite recently, that the NHS was the most socialist thing that any government has ever done in the UK, and it's the most popular. By extension, other elements of the... I mean, there's been a concerted campaign. It didn't start recently, but it obviously increased under Thatcher and now under the current coalition government, to try and rubbish all the achievements of the 45 government. And we see that not only with the things they find it easier to pick off, like welfare benefits and legal aid, but increasingly with the NHS as well. And this is the coalition on the right between Tory politicians and their friends in big business who make money out of it, and their friends in the media who spread a lot of lies about it. And there was but again, that's the job, not just of Tony Benn. That's the job of people on the left to try and both rebut those arguments, but also to reaffirm the values that led to the setting up of the welfare state in the first place.
Well, Chris, I mean, one very big, perhaps the biggest point at which it's been possible to kind of reverse the political culture from campaigning, by campaigning from below, is over the war. There's been over a decade now of majority public opinion opposed to not only the Afghan and Iraq wars, but the intervention in Libya, the possibility of an intervention in Syria. There's no doubt it's changed the political culture in this country, and Ben had a lot to do with that.
He did, and I think we'll miss him terribly as part of that whole process. The number of meetings that he's done for Stop the War, the number of rallies, the speeches he made in Trafalgar Square, the general work he's done for the movement has been fantastic. And he always mentioned the war. It didn't matter what he was speaking on, and I think that's very important. He saw, actually, his speech at the big 2 million demo on February the 15th, 2003, wasn't just about the war. He understood that the war was part of a bigger system, and he said, we need to be building a movement on many, many fronts, and that was an important part of his political viewpoint. But the other thing about him that I think is a lesson to us all is he was prepared to put his neck on the line, and there were a number of times over the last 10 or 12 years when we've had difficult arguments. For example, I remember after the bombings in 2005, the London bus and tube bombings, we wanted to respond to them in a sensitive way, but by pointing to the fact that actually the war on terror was in fact creating the conditions for terrorism. And that was obviously a tricky thing to do, an important thing to do. We phoned him up. He's one of the first people to say, yes, I'll come and speak. Now, many politicians wouldn't have done that. Many political figures wouldn't have done that. It's very, very important he did that. There were other times when we had marches that were being banned, when he was the first to phone us up and say, it's an outrage, I'll be right at the front and I'm prepared to get arrested. So he had a broad appeal, but he was also extremely principled and radical.
I mean, John, similarly on the question of Palestine, which, hasn't always commanded the kind of support that it does now, actually. I mean, it's still a very contested issue, but the support for the Palestinians is probably at a historic high in this country. And Ben was one of the people who never shied away from that issue.
Absolutely, and early on as well. I think that's another part of it, exactly as Chris is saying in respect of the 7/7 bombings here. But if you think back in apartheid in South Africa, he was one of the people to put the first motions forward to condemn apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid in Palestine, he was right there at the front. And that sense of understanding the importance of particular struggles, understanding where the right line was going to be. That was one of his great contributions, I think, at the same time. But seeing it all in the context of this broad fight against imperialism, and that goes back to his history. He was very, very strong in the anti-colonial movement, and he kept that going, seeing new forms of imperialism, whether it was imperialism through war or just through economic expansion and the power given to capital to expand without limit across the world. He was in all of those different struggles and joining them up so you could understand them as part of one whole programme. I mean, Andrew, you've been involved in solidarity work with the Palestinians yourself. It's not absolutely unknown, but it is quite unusual for a leading political figure like that to have the kind of in-depth analysis of imperialism, really, of seeing these questions as linked questions and linked to the nature of the economic society in which we live. And Ben did have that, didn't he?
It didn't used to be. I think that John made exactly the right point, which is that Tony was around for so long. He was in the anti-colonial struggle, he was in the anti-apartheid struggle, and he took that analysis through to issues like the Iraq War. And although the Labour Party lost its way, certainly on the Iraq War, or parts of the Labour Party, not the majority of the Labour Party, and for those of us who opposed it throughout, Tony, among other voices, was a strong voice there. But what you now see is the Labour Party, I think, finding its roots again, partly because you have those lines of continuity like Tony Benn. So, yes, the support for Palestine has never been greater in the country. It's never been greater in the Labour Party either. Yes, opposition to foreign adventurism has never been greater in the country, but also in the Labour Party. You've got, I mean, let's remember, one of Tony Benn's friends was Ralph Miliband, the father of Ed Miliband. Ed Miliband, one of the first things he did on being elected leader was to apologise for the stance we took on the Iraq War. Ed Miliband was responsible for opposing the intervention in Syria, which not only stopped Britain getting involved in another horrific incident of bombing a Muslim Arab country, but also effectively stopped the Americans doing it as well. And Ed Miliband, the first Labour leader in a generation, say, yes, we would recognise a Palestinian state. So that legacy, if you like, that lifetime of achievement, and of course, for somebody who works very hard on the Palestinian cause myself, I'm delighted to see those changes in the Labour Party. A lot of the tribute to that must go down to Tony Benn for the consistency of his stand over 50 or 60 years.
I mean, Chris, latterly I certainly got the impression talking to Ben that although, as Andrew would no doubt make the point, he took obviously a party affiliation and his affiliation to the Labour Party very seriously. In a way, no matter how seriously he took that, there was one other thing which was bigger, and that was the issues. He always used to say it's personalities, not issues. It's the broad movements where we all unite, no matter what party we're in, that create the environment where you can change party politics. So certainly latterly, and maybe all the way through, there was a primacy to kind of grassroots struggle, wasn't there?
Yeah, I think that's true. I suspect, I mean, I didn't know him before 2000, really, but I mean, I suspect that became bigger and bigger part of his political outlook. Although, as you say, I also think that it was probably there from the start. And in a sense, you got the feeling that he kind of parked the question of the Labour Party. He didn't, I'm talking about in the last 10 or 12 years. I mean, he didn't really want to go there because I'm not sure that he knew what he thought. I mean, as you say, he kept no doubt a kind of basic loyalty to it. But at the same time, I think he'd realised that something's badly broken in the British democratic situation, and that it had to be resolved, and that the only way, the only kind of organisations now that are really, in general terms, reflecting the opinions of ordinary people are those that mobilise people. I mean, that was the thing about the anti-war movement back in 2003 and subsequently. It represented the anti-war sentiment, but also the massive disappointment that people felt at being let down in Parliament. So that raised the question of, well, maybe we have to do these things ourselves. And certainly that was the feeling you got in the last years from his speeches. You got the feeling that he really did believe that it was ordinary people, in the end of the day, who were going to change the world. And of course, partly that is the secret to his popularity, because he kept saying that, he kept delivering on that, and so people responded. And I remember in June last year when he came to the People's Assembly and spoke to an audience of 4,500 people, his walking stick was barely out of the curtains before there was a standing ovation. And I think that's if there's one single legacy from or memory from his life, it is the incredible sort of pride and affection you feel in the fact that this man said these things, but also the response to that message, the response to the message that we're going to have to do this thing ourselves, is and was incredibly inspiring.
I mean, it's almost shocking. Some of the footage of his early career. I think it's a crowd of up in Scotland around the time of the UCS sit-in, and he appears on the stage, and there's some kind of moaning and sort of because he's a minister and whatnot, and you think, whoa, how can that be happening? That was you'd have to go back a long way before you found a crowd that was in anything short of in adulation, really, wouldn't you?
Yes. I mean, I think people felt that he was speaking directly to them, and that he was standing alongside them, that he wasn't lecturing down or from another place which said, actually, your views aren't worth it. He was very much with the movement and speaking and saying the things that people felt. And the fact that that's such an unusual quality in politicians speaks to the crisis of democracy in our country. The fact that people are not politically apathetic, they're politically disenfranchised. They just don't feel that anybody else in parliamentary politics is speaking and saying the sort of things that they would say. And I think that's what Tony Benn did. And that's why, to go back to where we started, a lot of the establishment was so unhappy with the fact that he was showing them up for being so distant to where people really are.
Andrew, I mean, there were many kind of strands that informed his thought. Obviously, the history of the Labour movement, the history of the Labour Party. He was certainly never hostile to and often paid compliment to the Marxist tradition. He also took seriously religious faith, but he never harped on about it. Perhaps, do you think that perhaps the thing that came most from that was the ability to almost parabolize political points, to make a complex thing simple yet deep at the same time?
Yeah, I think he was a religious man without being someone, a particular adherent of any particular part of any particular faith, and but he understood. He came from a strong nonconformist background, and he understood the importance of religion, and I think he understood Islam very well. And he made a point. I say it's part of his constant re-education process. Yeah, he was, as I said before, he was a Renaissance man. He had a lot of insights which are quite rare in politicians. I would say that he hadn't been a minister for 30 or 40 years, and sometimes when you're in government you do make unpopular decisions, and he had, if you like, the luxury of being in opposition, whether the Labour Party was in opposition or in government. He was a voice of protest. But let's not forget also that he stayed within the Labour movement, and a lot of the people who are now criticising him are people who bailed out, people who went to the SDP or to other parties. And
because it's quite remarkable when you hear people say he split the Labour Party, when actually people split from the Labour Party because they couldn't stomach a democratic debate with Tony Benn, really.
I've got a lot of time for people like Roy Hatterley and Dennis Healey. They may not have got on with Tony Benn, but at least they stayed within and fought their corner. Other people, and some of those people, the people who left because they didn't like, they say, Tony Benn's politics, are now supporting David Cameron's politics. Some of the people who went to the SDP are now in the House of Lords and the House of Commons supporting what is really one of the most reactionary governments we've ever had in this country.
Just finally on that, perhaps, I think it was E.P. Thompson, the famous Marxist historian, who said that the British working class owed more to Methodism than to Marxism. And some people say, whoa, that's it's religious and so forth. But partly it misunderstands what nonconformity in Britain does. It's an outsider's religion. It's a critique of the establishment, often historically a persecuted one. So it's less of an insult than it might sound, perhaps, Chris.
No, I think that's right. He had a remarkable ability to see in a whole number of different places deep desire for change that was articulated in unusual ways, not in the sort of narrow socialist tradition. And I think he kind of encapsulated the sort of coming together of lots of different strands of radical thought, and he saw it in religion and amongst other things. He also had a fantastic way of articulating, in very, very simple terms, those kind of desires.
Well, I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to halt this examination of Tony Benn's life and legacy, because we've run out of time on analysis. You can follow the debate, though, on our Twitter feed and on our Facebook page, and of course you can come back for future editions of this programme. Thanks for watching.